Hello and welcome to Fascinated by Fungi Live. We're going to be speaking with Leah Bendlin today, otherwise known as Leah Mycelia. She is one of my original myco muses, one of the first people I ran into on Instagram that was able to help me start identifying mushrooms. She's always been really patient, really knowledgeable, really just helpful and a great friend. She's an epic naturalist and has been a board member on the Oregon Mycological Society for a few years. She speaks frequently at myco gatherings. She does photography. She does classes. She is also a pretty epic myco chef. I've seen her eat a lot of varieties that I haven't seen anyone else eat. So I'm really excited to be talking with her today. She's actually one of the last people I saw kind of right before quarantine and COVID kicked in, so it'll be nice to kind of catch up with her because I don't think I've seen her since March. So this will be a phone. I'm just waiting for her to join in here, and we'll get this thing going. But per usual, I think this chat's going to kind of go where I'm going to be interviewing Leah, and we're going to be having sort of a high level mushroom discussion. But feel free to chime in on the chat, and I'll see if I can spin any of the questions you guys are asking into what we're talking about. So, hoping there she is. Hey Leah, okay, I'm going to add you.
Off we go. Hello.
Hi,
How you doing?
I'm doing all right. This is my first time on Instagram Live TV. Hi, Mom. My
Yeah,
mom
mom.
probably can't figure out how to watch this, but
Well, my mom's here. She's been watching a lot of these, so I'm thankful to her, and I think moms can figure it out. But
Hi, Gordon's mom.
it's that same group feeling of your parents come to your soccer game or whatever. My parents still show up to see me yap about mushrooms. So it's a
Yeah,
nice thing.
cool.
Yeah. How you doing? How's life? I mean, Portland has been nuts and the world has been kind of insane, but are you still finding solace in mushrooms and going out to the woods and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a constant through my life. My car is broken right now,
Oh, jeez.
so that
Sorry.
sucks, and that's keeping me from doing some of the mushroom stuff that I want to do. But I just biked out to a local place yesterday. I found some bluets,
Ooh, nice.
found some gomphidius, and those were really the only two edible things that I found. So I was like, all right, I'm collecting gomphidius to eat. Why not? I mean, I've eaten it before, and I don't remember. I remember it being kind of like bland,
Was
but
it
its substance.
Gomphidius oregensis or?
Yeah, so there's Oregonensis. It was probably Oregonensis. Yeah, it's one of the like black spotty ones.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I don't know what I'll do with that, but yeah, still finding solace in mushrooms, um, and like collecting other things. Like I collected some chickweed. So it just feels good to like pick up little natural things, for eating,
Yeah,
especially.
you get those little serotonin boosts, and not to mention you get a
Definitely.
little bit of food. So
Yep, yep. But COVID times are hard. I miss hanging out with people. I'm so glad that I got to hang out with you like before this all happened.
yeah,
Me and my girlfriend were on a road trip in California, and like one of the last things that we did was see Gordon for just a little while. And yeah, then shit hit the fan.
yeah. I didn't. Looking back at that night, we had dinner with Jeff Starwood too, and it seemed kind of normal. There was an event in the city we were supposed to go to, and we had to cancel because of COVID stuff, and it felt kind of weird. But we're
Right,
like, okay, we can have dinner. We can all sit inside around a table and eat without
right.
wearing masks or being worried about gathered in a group of more than X people kind of thing. And that was, I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, the food we had that night was really good too. It was like we
Oh
kind of
yeah.
had Indian stuff, and there was like a sag paneer, and we made it like vegan by choice. You could add cheese. I think we added cheese, but Jess was
Yeah,
able
and
to
we
have it
had a
vegan. So
super good like miner's lettuce salad. I
yeah,
remember
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
being
yeah.
a
That was good.
knockout item.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
totally.
like very shortly after that, I went to a bar in California for my birthday and like danced with people. It was wonderful. Like, wow, so long ago.
When that was still a thing. It'll be a thing
Yeah.
again. We just gotta get through it, I guess.
Yeah. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Oops. Life has been a little odd. Kind of been furloughed for the last several months, so I don't have sort of official employment, but I'm still doing stuff through Davis and working on some research things that I've got going on. So that's fun. But Jerry and I just got back from a little road trip up to Humboldt and Oregon, which is really fantastic. And I had, we're trying to be very safe and minimizing contact and all that stuff. But I had to go somewhere, and it was really nice to go out after a little bit of rain. And we got really lucky in some nice kind of pine dune habitat, which I'd never really explored, and found a bunch of Matsutake. So that was really exciting. But it was really wonderful to kind of get out there, because for the past like 3 months, the only thing I've been able to find is chicken in the woods, and it was nice to get a little more diversity in my life.
Yeah. I wouldn't complain about finding some chicken in the woods, though.
No. But I mean, if you come down here,
like...
I got pounds of it in the fridge. You can take as much as you want.
Okay. All right. Cool. What do you like to do with the Matsutaki?
Oh man, I'm still figuring it out as an edible mushroom to some degree, because I think the first time I got it, I was like, oh, just fry it in butter like you do any other mushroom. And I tried it and didn't like it. I didn't see what the big deal was. And it wasn't until I realized, I looked up some recipes and applications, how do people use this mushroom? It was like, oh, cooking it with rice, putting it in soup. There's a thing I did up at Adams a couple years ago, and I think you came late to that, but I just made basically a very like simple miso soup with some green onions in it. And then right at the end, I took Matsutake and shaved it in very, very thin, just into the miso soup, and kind of let it just barely cook through. And that was a really nice one, because that Matsutake aroma perfumes anything you do with it. So that's a good one.
Okay, I'm seeing some suggestions: kind of roast in oven, peanut oil, soy, ginger, garlic.
Those are good ones. Good. For sure. The other one no, go ahead.
I have had, my favorite preparation so far has been pickled in like a sweet pickle with some ginger.
Nice.
Yeah, that was good. And it like just goes very well with the sweet spicy.
Yeah, the sweet. Yeah, exactly. I can see that. The other thing I did that I really, really liked was, somebody had suggested making Matsutake Sake, which I did. Yeah. We just sliced it up and poured cheap sake over it and put it in a jar in the fridge. And you could, for the first week or two, you could drink it, and then the sake gets kind of old and you can use it for cooking. But I made another version of it where I added some salt and some sugar and just a little bit of MSG, and it became Matsutake mirin. And that actually, it didn't oxidize quite as much as the other one, so it maintained a little bit more aroma and freshness. And it was really, really good for putting into rice or stir fries or any dish you'd use mirin kind of thing. So.
Okay. My
to consider.
Tends to be like a little bit simple. I am more about going out into the woods and getting things, and then I'm like, what do I do with all these mushrooms? And so I try and keep a lot of like chefy friends who I can give the mushrooms to, but maybe don't have the time or interest to go and find the things, and then work together on these things. COVID has made that a little bit more difficult, so I'm doing what I can to get a little creative with things.
Yeah, I definitely miss being able to have big dinner parties. And the problem for me is I like to cook, and I like to cook for lots of people. Yeah. So like if I make something that Jerry doesn't like, it just sits in the fridge because there's no one else there to eat it.
I know. When I was at both times I've been at your house, you sent me with a whole bunch of your leftovers and stuff, which I so appreciate. If I'm on a road trip and just have free food all of a sudden, it's great.
Yeah, I miss being able to just dump food onto people and say, here, take this. I want to cook more, and I don't want to eat these leftovers, so just take them with you. But
I will always take your leftovers if that is an option.
Cool. So I have a couple of things I want to get into asking you about, and I guess, eating and cooking mushrooms was definitely one of them. But one of the things I wanted to kind of query you about was something I think I'd heard you talk about with Darren on the Welcome to Mushroom Hour podcast, which if you guys haven't listened to Leah's episode on that, it's fantastic. You can get more on her background and all sorts of stuff. But you brought up the difference between a saprobe versus something that's saprophytic. And can you speak to that difference in terminology? Because I'm still trying to, in my own head, set it the right way, and I want to hear what you have to say again, and if, other people can hear it. So.
Yeah, so I am a word nerd. I love to know and I love just a little shout out to like Breakfast of Champignons. She does the Eddamundays.
Yeah, those are amazing.
So those just teach you about like the roots of the the word origins. So saprotroph, so troph is like deriving nutrition from, and sapro is like dead decaying stuff. So a saprotroph is something that feeds on decaying stuff, or it decays stuff by feeding on it and derives nutrition from that. So the word saprophyte or saprophytic, the word phyte means plant. So that is a plant that is decaying dead stuff and eating dead stuff.
Is there an example of a plant that does that?
No. So no
Okay.
plants like that
So no
exist.
plants, yeah, because plants they are anabolic. They're not catabolic. There's no plant that
Right.
acts like a fungi. That's what makes plants
Right.
and fungi different, right? Anabolic versus
Yep.
catabolic.
Yep, and it used to be that there were a lot. I mean, there still are these plants, but there are these oddball plants that people didn't really understand how to characterize, and so they were just like they didn't have any green parts, so it seemed like they weren't doing the same thing. They weren't making their own food via photosynthesis. So people just thought that they were breaking down stuff in the soil in the same way that like fungi would and eating off of them, and they called them saprophytes. But we now know that no plants, at least as far as anyone knows, actually do that. And all the things that were once termed saprophytes are either mycoheterotrophic plants, so they are in a relationship with the roots of, the mycelium of fungi and getting nutrition that way. And we can talk more about that if you want.
Oh, yeah.
Or they're direct parasites on plants. So there's nothing that's a saprophyte.
Right.
People do frequently use the word saprophytic for mushrooms as well, or fungi of various sorts, and it's in fairly common usage so that like people understand that it's stuff that's breaking down dead stuff. But if you would really like to be more accurate about the way you're choosing words, saprotroph would be the correct term for that.
Yeah, or saprobe, I guess, are all the above. Which I think it really underlies again the difference that we didn't understand the difference between fungi and plants until like the 70s. I mean, people understood the difference, but they didn't biologically, taxonomically classify them as different kingdoms, which I think again kind of gets at the idea that fungi have been cryptic and kind of understudied and potentially underappreciated throughout most of our scientific history. Because they were always lumped in with other things and sort of, it's easy to understand because they are hidden. They don't show up all the time. They're kind of ephemeral. They're ethereal. They don't, hang around for a long time unless we're talking like about a big conch on a tree or something like that. So I think it's very easy to misunderstand them from a human perspective. And I love, you're one of those people who really helped me see fungi from the level of a fungi and try to put myself in the place of a mushroom and understand, the world as a mushroom rather than me always projecting my human, perceptions and anthropomorphization onto that mushroom. But
that's like a big thing in culture, especially colonizer culture, is to like project oneself onto the world rather than appreciating it for what it is. And we all have to do our best to try and unlearn that and think of it. I do see somebody has a really good comment in the chat about what about carnivorous plants?
Yeah.
Great exception, but I still think it wouldn't be considered saprotrophic because carnivorous plants still have green parts and
they're still photosynthesizing.
Right. Yeah. I don't know a lot about them, but it seems like they're still photosynthesizing. They're just getting some of their nutrition also from bugs that are, alive until they catch them.
Yeah. And I think what it is there's enzymes in there that break down and make the nitrogen bioavailable, but they're not necessarily like degrading the chitin in the exoskeletons. Because I know like with my pitcher plants and stuff, you'll still see lots of bugs in there. It's just that the bugs are like, if you touch them, they kind of turn to powder and dust. But they've seemed to lost their substance, but they still have like the shell. So I have a feeling that maybe like the chitin never gets broken down.
So they're getting something from it. But that's interesting. I had never thought about that as maybe an exception to the rule. Maybe like they're kind of partially, but still, I would call them carnivorous or at least semi-carnivorous.
They're not breaking down other plant matter. At least they're breaking down bugs. So they're breaking down insects, animals. So that's where they're deriving. And I mean, in another way, and I want to go into mycoheterotrophs, but this just popped up in my head because I think it's super interesting. Some white rot fungi, like oyster mushrooms and the wine cap King Stropharia, use little like lassos, and because they live in nitrogen poor environments, which is wood. Wood is not a particularly good source of nitrogen, and fungi need lots of nitrogen. So they put out these little lassos into the wood, and they wait for nematodes to kind of swim along, and the nematode goes through, and they pull the lasso tight, and then they suck all the nitrogen out of that nematode, and that's like.
Yeah.
We think about fungi as not moving a lot, but they're pretty active in their own little ways.
Right. Which also makes me think like, trying to give things very clear categories for how they are deriving nutrition or really doing like anything is very reductive.
Yeah.
And there's so much that we don't understand about how things interact, that giving them these very clear ecological niches seems problematic sometimes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, and I've been dealing with that a lot because I came from my scientific background as like a biochemist, and what biochemistry was and still is in many ways is very reductive science. So let's take a whole organism, let's turn it into a big soup of stuff, and then let's pull out particular components, isolate them, purify them, and then test their activity under certain conditions, kind of thing. And that is like the definition of reductive science. You're taking one little component out of the whole and trying to see how it works, but you're not taking into account how it works inside of the cell when it has other binding partners or differences in pH, or is part of it in a little cell membrane or something like that. And we've done the same thing with all these organisms in the wild, and particularly like with fungi and plants, we pull them out of their natural environment, we put them in a lab and we study them. And then we're amazed when we find out that there's relationships there that we didn't catalog and we can't categorize. There's a lot of mushrooms that can switch from being saprobes into being mycorrhizal and vice versa, and potentially even being parasitic because they have the genes to do both. And just depending on what life cycle phase they're in or what environment they're exposed to, they'll make a decision to go one way or the other. So I always tell people that like fungi love to just kind of throw off these categorizations that we as humans try to put them into.
Right, and there's like some of the boletes, like the Oreoboletus mirabilis, the admirable bolete, like that fruits from hemlock wood, and yes, it's mycorrhizal, but maybe it also has some saprotrophic capabilities. And some of those like russulas will fruit directly from wood occasionally. So, and I know that like people are still trying to pin down exactly what sort of relationship is going on with hygrospy and mosses, and other things that it's growing on, like it could be some kind of mycorrhizal saprotrophic combo or something.
Or even
so,
like maybe working as an endophyte is one of the things I was, because it's
yeah.
not a full mycorrhizal associationship. It's more like a symbiotic something, but then maybe it's inside of the plant as well as being semi-micro.
Yeah, endophytes are
cool.
so fascinating. Like I would love to learn more about them, but for people who don't know, like endophytes are fungi that are living inside of the cells of plants.
Yeah, between plant cells like this, they live in between kind of.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And doing who knows what in there. Some of the things, you can take a pretty good guess about what they're doing, but not always. And I've heard like some talk about that morels are actually living as endophytes in plants, and then maybe switch to a saprotrophic lifestyle when the plant is dying. That's why you might see them around like dying elm trees. But there's like Xylaria species that live as endophytes, and like maybe they're conferring some sort of benefit to the plant that they're living with, and then maybe they like help to hasten the decomposition after the thing is already on its way out. But yeah, there's so much to still be studied about endophytes, and they're just fascinating. Like how many different fungi, especially ones that we even know as forming fruit bodies, are living inside of plants when they're alive, doing who knows what.
Yeah, I mean, I've said a lot of times, like if I could do a second PhD, I think I would go back and study endophytes because there's so much depth there and so much. I mean, the way that they live in between those plant cells, and the theory is that they act as a little bit of like an innate immune system for those plants, because if something else tries to come and invade between the plant cells, the fungi is like, nah, I'm here already. And that, I mean, I know you've heard of Taxol before. It's a cancer drug. So
Yeah.
that was derived from yew trees, but it was derived from one of the endophytes that lives inside the yew tree.
Oh, I
So
didn't know that.
that's like an example, a real life example of something that we've derived from endophytes that's saving lives all over the place. Uh,
Oh,
and
I
then
thought
there's
it
a
was just a thing that was like part of the tree. I mean, it
I
is, but
I
like
thought it
it's
is,
another
but
organism.
exactly. And it's not,
Okay.
I don't think that organism makes that compound unless it's like associated with the yew tree necessarily. So there
Okay.
is some really interesting back and forth. The other thing you see a lot with endophytes is they tend to modify like the gene expression of the plant. So frequently having like a grass that has a particular endophyte, the grass will be very sensitive to drought, but when it has the endophyte, it's suddenly drought resistant. Um,
Mm.
and that's common with a lot of plants that if you have a mycorrhizal partner, there's clearly more surface areas, they can absorb more nutrients and they're better able to buffer stress. But it can completely shift, like the disease resistance of a plant. You don't need to do GMO stuff. You might just infect it with like the right endophyte and boom, it does exactly what you need or what you want it to do.
Mm-hmm.
Which isn't going to happen if you spray your whole field with fungicides. But
Yep. Yep. I mean, as much as I worry about like spraying a whole field with fungicides, I also have some worry about like adding fungi that we don't know a ton about to other plants. Just because like as we were just talking about, there's so many complex relationships that we don't know about with environmental things, and we just have a history of messing things up so badly by bringing one thing in to counteract another.
yes, yeah,
But
without fully
um, you
understanding
know,
those complex webs of relationships we're talking about. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Cool. I see someone who's saying that the asexual form of morels are abundant in many ecosystems, and that's another thing we didn't even touch on. But like many fungi have an asexual stage where they're like reproducing clonally, and then like a sexual stage where they're putting out spores, sexual spores versus clonal spores. And there's actually a really cool mushroom that I think I've seen near you or with you at some point. It's the Dendrocalibia, and it's this little
Mm-hmm.
mushroom that grows on like decaying rustlers. And from the top, from the cap, it's dropping sexual spores, and then on the stipe, it has these little nubs, and it's putting out clonal spores. So it's like buffering and doing both forms of reproduction at the same time. But we in the world of fungi terminology, and when I came from yeast, we call them like telomorphs and anamorphs. I think telomorphs are the sexual stage, and anamorphs are the clonal stage. I don't know if you is that right? Do you remember?
Anamorph is the asexual stage.
Asexual, yeah, clonal asexual. Okay, yeah. So, and that's amazing because you'll see like one fungus that you think is you totally understand this mushroom. Suddenly you'll find out its asexual stage is like an endophyte in some other plant that you've never even thought about, and that's its like natural reservoir of where it lives when it's not out there producing mushrooms for you, kind of thing. So,
Yeah, fungi are queer AF.
yeah,
I like
totally.
it.
Yeah, not
Yep.
to mention some fungi like the Schizophilum commune and the birch polypore have like 23,000 or 27,000 genders.
Yeah.
That's pretty mind blowing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Mating types. I feel like fungi don't have genders, or maybe they do. We haven't
It's
asked
it's
them, but
it's
like,
mating types, but yeah.
right. Right. Yeah. Cool.
Can
Yeah,
you
and I
think of
didn't
yeah?
know that about some of the asexual ones being inside of plants. Like I know that there are a lot of fungi that have asexual forms that look super different from the sexual forms
Mhm,
that people are still putting together. Like you'll have two different names for the same species because the two
exactly.
forms look radically different. And then over time, as people do DNA sequencing or whatever, hold on to this thing for long enough, we'll find out that these are actually the same species, just in different stages. And so then you get these two names that have to be merged.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that because again, that's that reductive approach where we took okay everything that looks the same, let's put it into a category, let's label it with science, and now we're like, oh man, fungi just like don't care about our categories, they don't care about the way that we want to define things. They're just going to do what they do, and that's I think that's a great lesson to take away too from nature and life is like you might think that everything is going to go on this straight and narrow path, and then once you get there, you realize that it's all a mess and life is almost never linear, and you just have to get used to living in that confusion, that gray area, because otherwise it's always going to be really, really tough.
Yeah. Ooh, so this reminds me, I've been watching the show on Netflix,
Hmm.
Kipo and the Wonder Beasts. It's a cartoon.
I love that show.
I would highly recommend it to people. It's like just a show full of joy when you are trying to do some good escapism, but
Yep.
also kind of a post-apocalyptic dystopia
Hmm. Hmm.
at the same time. But there's a bug on that show who goes through endless
Yeah.
morphs.
Yep.
Yeah.
Every time he gets stressed out,
Over.
he ends up morphing, basically.
Yes, and that just makes me think about that. It's like it defies your expectations of what he never dies because he just continually morphs into a new thing. So yeah,
Sometimes more or less helpful to the particular situation
right.
going on. But yeah, and there's some interesting social commentary in that show as well. I think about, the concept of otherness and what is belonging, and what is normal versus, what is just, what can we accept and what can we move on with, kind of thing. So it's a
Yeah.
fun show. Speaking of fun cartoons on Netflix, have you ever watched Hilda?
I just started watching it actually. Yes, it's like, yep, I like it. I was looking for something calm that I could watch at night that wouldn't be too heavy.
Yeah.
And I have been enjoying it. Yeah.
Yeah, I've actually rewatched Hilda twice, because I mean the first like 2 or 3 episodes when she's living in the woods are like the best. When she
Yeah.
moves to the city, it's okay, but
Yeah.
that's a fun one. So I want to ask you about mycoheterotrophs, because the
Uh-huh.
first sort of fungi gathering that I ever went to was Santa Cruz myco whatever camp it was back in 2017, and you gave a talk on mycoheterotrophs, which I was super excited about already, but after seeing you talk, I kind of opened my eyes up to how many of them there were. Because I'd seen back home in Massachusetts, I'd run into ghost pipes, these little, white
Mhm.
Monotropa uniflora, and I, read that they were parasitic on Russula, mycelium, and that was pretty much all I really knew. I think I'd seen some yellow pine sap, so I was already like, I was hooked, but I had no idea how much diversity, the colors, the shapes, the complex ecological relationships, and all the different species they could associate with. And so you opened my eyes up to that. Do you want to talk a little bit about like your journey with mycoheterotrophs and like what inspired you, and how you've learned more, and maybe some cool relationships that you've noticed yourself?
Sure. So I think probably like many of the fungi nerds that I know, for whatever reason, I became obsessed with fungi. Like once I just started going out into the woods and noticing things. Like I had been in the woods, kind of noticing things for my whole life, but hadn't first of all hadn't lived in the Pacific Northwest my whole life,
That helps.
and then my friend Alex just turned me onto the idea of looking for mushrooms because we went out chanterelle hunting together, and then probably many of y'all have had this experience where you're like, oh, how have I not noticed these before? These things are freaking everywhere.
Yeah. Especially when they're super colorful and you're like, why have I not like keyed into this before?
Right. And suddenly you can't stop seeing them. And which is great. Like it gives you something to look forward to every day. There are more mushrooms to be found and discovered and studied. But once I started doing that, I also started noticing mycoheterotrophic plants, which look like mushrooms. And I'm an active member of the Oregon Mycological Society. Occasionally, people will bring them into the ID table there, thinking they're mushrooms. I think I thought it was a mushroom the first time that I saw it, but like, especially if they start to be well formed enough, you can see that there's a little flower on it. Like it
Right.
doesn't look like a normal plant, but it does have a flower that's fairly recognizable as a flower and having petals and stamens and stuff. So I think I just did some Googling on Monotropa uniflora and was
Was
like,
that the
oh,
first one that you kind of found? Was that your
yeah,
gateway
that was the
one? Yeah,
first
okay,
one that
same.
I noticed. And you know what? I think what like really sparked my interest was that I saw a talk by Steve Trudell. He came and gave a talk to the Oregon Mycological Society,
Mm,
and it was about Tricholoma, the genus of
hmm.
mushrooms. And in that, he included a picture of Allotropa virgata, the candy stick,
Hmm.
which is like, if people haven't seen it, it looks like a candy cane, like it's red and
Legit
white
looks like candy
striped,
cane,
and it
just like,
has
yeah.
black flowers. It's so beautiful. It is one of my favorite plants in existence. Feel blessed every time I encounter it. And my mind was just blown. I was like, that exists. Wow. Okay, and also it can be associated with this edible, or it is associated with this edible mushroom, Matsutaki, which at the time I hadn't even heard of and didn't really care about. I was just like, whoa, that plant is awesome. And once I started to be able to learn to recognize those things as plants and that they were out there, and spent more time looking for mushrooms and stuff, especially in the summer months when there are less mushrooms, you see these kind of odd, like once you're mushroom hunting enough, you get this eye for the things that are not like the rest of the area. And mycoheterotrophic plants stand out as that.
They really, and yeah, you're walking along and suddenly there's this thing that's just almost glowing, especially if like the sun hits it just right. It looks otherworldly. You're like, this can't be real. This has to, someone must have left like a fake plastic thing in the woods, but here it is rising up out of the ground. You find them all over the place and you're like, what's happening here?
Yeah. And so I really wanted to just know more about like what was going on with them. What are they doing? Because, I also like a lot of my journey about learning about fungi has been interacting with people. Like I learn a lot from just talking to people. And sometimes, a lot of the time, that is by talking with people on Facebook. And on Facebook and as in other social media, you get people of all different sorts of expertise levels, many of them who are fairly poorly informed, just throwing out like wild speculation, and that often leads me to do these deep dives to try and figure out, okay, what's misinformation here? What can we actually find out about? And also spending a lot of time on Google Scholar, looking at some deep science papers, like to the extent that we know things, and there's a lot that is still unknown. And I wanted to challenge myself to understand these things as best as possible, because I hadn't heard anybody else doing any presentations on mycoheterotrophic plants, but a lot of people with interests about them. So I read fully probably about 100-ish scientific papers, many of which included terminology that I had no idea about, so I'm looking up like every third word.
Right. There's a lot of esoteric science gobbledygook out there.
Dense and sometimes grueling. And like I've given this presentation a few times now, but you'll never get back like monetarily the amount of time that you spend putting into something like this. I spent so much time. But it was really worth it to me in understanding how these things relate to other things. So mycoheterotrophic plants derive their nutrition not from producing chlorophyll, from photosynthesizing, but from attaching to the mycelium of fungi, generally speaking mycorrhizal fungi, although there are exceptions with orchids in the tropics. So generally mycorrhizal fungi. So these fungi are then attached to the roots of trees where they do nutrient exchange. And the mycoheterotrophic plant ends up taking the nutrients primarily from the tree via the fungus, but also takes some from the fungus as well. So it's essentially parasitizing both of those, but it's more or less using the fungus as a conduit to steal nutrients from the tree, who is capable of photosynthesis. And so usually they're described as parasites, and it seems like that's mostly true. It doesn't seem like it really gives anything back, but there are some isolated incidents that need more exploration about what they are doing. And also it's probably not the same thing for every mycoheterotrophic plant, right?
Right.
Like
there's a lot of different relationships that are going on. It's not just the same mode for every single plant and tree and fungi combo, because there's a lot of differentiation there. There's many different species that can form the same kind of web.
Right. Yeah. So I'm thinking of, like, specifically of pine drops, Pterospora andromedia, which attaches to rhizopogon fungi and has been shown to increase mycelial mass and makes these like balls of mycelium where it's attached. And so it's in some way it seems like it's stimulating that fungus to grow. And if that's good for the fungus, like usually more body for the fungus is better. it may actually be doing something to benefit it. But
and you might think that the more mycelium means there's more root surface area for the tree, which means that it might have a higher photosynthetic capacity. So as much as it looks like the pine drops are just parasitizing, maybe it's helping to spread the mycelium and actually make the trees and the whole network, the whole forest stronger too, because it's that crosstalk between all those different trees and all those different plants. So that, that's so cool.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the paper was like pretty careful in not extrapolating too far about exactly what's going on, but they're like, maybe there's a possibility that it's not strictly parasitic in this case. But I also want to say that like it seems like in most cases it is mostly parasitic, and I think that because they are really like magical looking plants, this is kind of another anthropomorphizing thing where we like want to give them more benevolent intentions. And, it may be that there are some like benevolent intentions, but they might just also be parasites. And that's okay.
I guess one of the things that's been my sort of pet theory, and this is maybe me projecting again, but I've just been thinking about it as I wander around the woods and I see these things. I found out that a lot of those mycoheterotrophs often are based on a rhizome. So it's kind of a thick, sugary root, like a ginger or something like that. And a lot of plants have rhizomes, but it's not quite a tuber. It's a little more dynamic than a tuber, but basically it's a battery, a plant battery underground.
Yep.
And I've wondered that maybe as part of like the disturbance ecology of, the way that fires move through habitats here in California and Oregon, that, again, conjecture, but maybe after a fire moves through, if the fire burns some of the mycelium in the soil or somehow is impacting the topsoil, maybe these rhizomes are acting almost as like a battery to recharge some carbon back into the mycelium and maybe like back into the tree to help it regenerate some more leaves. And again, pure conjecture, but just like it could make sense that there's ecological relationships like that. And just thinking too about the way that mycelium and trees aren't always sending equal amounts of carbon and nitrogen back and forth. It changes throughout the year. If the tree has full foliage, it's going to be producing way more sugars and sending sugars to the roots. If it has no leaves, maybe the fungi is actually sending some sugars back up to the tree. And if you start adding the mycoheterotrophs back into that equation, there's a lot of carbon and nitrogen moving all over the place. So it's just,
yeah,
it's
like,
really cool.
And I think that's a great question to follow up on. I hope someone does that.
Yeah, I had a good chat with Merlin about it, but yeah.
Yeah, so from what I had read, it seems like people had come to the conclusion that that tuberous kind of mass, it's like coralloid, but like generally speaking, a pretty like dense root ball mass that's like kind of all in one spot. Is like a storage area specifically for that plant because it spends so much time, so much energy just putting up those stalks, and it can't produce any of its own energy otherwise, that it really depends on that ball to just do this one thing. But yeah, I mean, we do seem to have, other than the tropics, a pretty wide diversity of mycoheterotrophic plants on the West Coast. Where, historically fire has been and still is a big part of the environment. So I'm so interested to hear more about that. It's an interesting question.
Yeah. Again, that was just, I completely made this up. There's no science behind that. That's just what I've been thinking about.
Yeah, but I mean, all science starts with an interesting question, right?
Yeah, just an idea.
Yeah.
I mean, so some of the ones, I just want to like some of the ones that are on the West Coast, we have, you do see Monotropa uniflora, the ghost pipes, at least up in Oregon. I haven't seen them here in California, but I know they exist. There's pine drops, and there's a couple of different species of pine drops. There's like coral roots, or pine saps.
There's just one pine drops and a couple of pine sap.
Oh, okay, so pine saps and pine. Shows up, I have a lot to learn. And then there's coral roots, which are maybe a kind of orchid, or
yes, they're orchids.
Orchids. I've seen snow plants. There's Sarcodes sanguinea. Those are really impressive. Alpine regions, giant red, crazy
and you
red.
don't see many of those in Oregon. Maybe in like southern Oregon, but they're mostly in California.
Okay. Yeah, I saw them in Shasta and the foothills this year. What else have I seen? Oh, man. Oh, Gnome Plant. I just ran into Gnome Plant. I'd never seen that one before. There's I mean, there's a whole bunch more. I know I saw one with you that I don't know if it was Mycoheterotroph, but it was this is some little like kind of purpley artichoke looking thing that was like right on the ground. We saw it in Shasta like 2 years
Oh,
ago.
probably Boschniakia, which also goes by Copsiopsis.
It's a common name for
Oh,
that.
someone help me with the common name for this thing.
Can't remember.
Ground comb.
Oh, great. Yeah, that was it.
So that one is a direct plant parasite, and
Okay.
depending on the species, it grows, I think, with manzanita or salal or a couple of other things.
Right. That was I remember we were sort of there was these like manzanita bushes, and you were pointing it out, and there was this like coyote mint, and it was just one of those moments that I was like, I'm so happy that Leah's around to like just look instead of me being like, oh look at this cool thing, you're like giving all of the ecology and the biology of this stuff. I'm just like I'm bathing and loving just like getting all this knowledge washing over me. I'm only gonna take small pieces of it, and I think that's what you're talking about. Like sometimes the best way to learn is to talk to people because you get hit with this wave of knowledge, and you'll hang on to some of it, and you'll hang on to the experience and the memory, and sometimes that's enough that you can go Google and do reading on your own, but just having that kind of personal experience with something helps cement it for you more than just trying to read about it in a book.
Yeah, and if you have questions, you can just ask them to the person immediately and get
Exactly.
feedback that is detailed to your question, which is just something that you don't always get from the internet and doing your own reading or Googling. Like I get so much more from having individual conversations with people. Definitely recommend using all of the resources available to learn if you're interested. But like, I feel like modern academia doesn't always value those kind of personal learning experiences with people as much as it should.
I mean, I think there's a thing that comes into play too, is because we all have access to the internet and smartphones, there's more information at our fingertips than ever. But what there's less of is the curation. We don't really have anyone to help us guide and say, this is good information, this is bad information. And as you mentioned with Facebook, there's a lot of stuff being thrown out, but there's a lot of anecdotal stuff. There's a lot of hearsay. There's a lot of information that somebody read in a book from 30 years ago where they're calling something saprophytic or something like that. And you're like, yeah, that's a little out of date. It's not quite the right term. And it's hard to, especially people who've been doing mushroom hunting for a long time, their facts are set. They learned it 20 years ago from some guy who learned it from somebody before. So there's a lot of this passed down knowledge, but because of sequencing, because of the advancements and stuff, there's a lot of new things coming out, and we lack people who are sort of clear curators of knowledge. And I'd say that you are one of those people out there who is, doing your best to try to put out good information and be patient and share the stuff as much as you can. And that's something I've always appreciated about you and your account and what you do on social media. So thank you.
Thank you. I also really appreciate everybody who gets into my DMs and tells me something new, because I like to share that with other people then too. And I've definitely fallen into that trap as well. Like I have presentations that I give over and over, and then someone will be like, well, actually now we know this. And I'm like, oh, I need to update that now. You don't always go and double check all of your facts before every presentation to see if something has changed in the meantime. Yeah. For instance, I give a presentation in some of the local parks where I talk about, just briefly talk about cordyceps and talk about the zombie ant, because it's real cool. And I used to say, because that's used to be what I had read, that it takes over the ant's brain and makes it climb to the top of the thing. But there's recent research that came out that said actually it affects everything except for the brain, because it needs the motor functions to still be doing their thing, which is actually even creepier in my opinion, because if you're this ant, you're still experiencing this fully, but
you're just watching yourself be this zombie while you're fully I mean, ants, I don't know how cognizant ants are, but the ant's brain is not impacted by the mycelium. Instead, the mycelium is acting hydraulically to move the ant. So can you imagine being in your body and watching yourself do something and having no control?
Terrifying.
That's a nightmare.
Yeah. And
Lord.
Julian, I see your comment down there. I so want to visit you in Chile. That is on my life list for sure. I would love to find some Chilean mushrooms with you. Oh, especially the Cyttaria.
Yeah. Oh my God, that is one of my top bucket list mushrooms. That was one I wanted to see in New Zealand. I never did. Did you see that in New Zealand when you were there?
I did
Or
find it
you
in New
did?
Zealand, and for
Cool.
folks who don't know, it's a super, like if you have trypophobia, like the fear of holes, like the thing with the lotus seed pods, this is not a mushroom you want to look at.
Let's see.
It's like this ball-like thing with a bunch of holes in it, kind of like a honeycomb.
If you look at this sticker, this is a version of a Cyttaria right here. Yeah, little
Yeah.
round thing with lots of holes.
Yeah, and at least the ones that I had in New Zealand had kind of a fruity taste to them, although I hear that ones that are elsewhere have slightly different tastes to them.
Okay.
And I knew that it was a possibility that I could find it in these Nothofagus forests, and always looking for mushrooms, obviously. And unfortunately, when I got there, there were only ones that had fallen off the tree already. But I wasn't in New Zealand for very long, and so I was like, I'm still gonna eat it. It's on the ground.
I gotta try this.
It didn't look rotten or anything, and it was good, fruity flavor. This is like one of the few things that you fungi-wise that you can eat raw, or that is typically eaten raw. They were
so
pretty
cool.
cool.
Yeah, and I guess I want to end by having a discussion about the new philosophy law in Oregon. But before I mention that, you just mentioned eating Cyttaria, which is something I've never even seen, but always aspired to see and eat in the same way that you mentioned, just taking a bite, because they're called beach strawberries, and they're supposed to have kind of, at least the ones in New Zealand are supposed to have a light, fruity flavor. I don't know about the ones in Chile and elsewhere. I'm sure that those probably have some cool ecology with them too, the way they fruit, or they might be endophytes or something. I need to learn more about them because I haven't explored them. But you are one of the most accomplished mycophagists out there. I don't know exactly how to phrase that, but you've eaten a lot of mushrooms. I mean, last time I checked, we were 200 plus species or something. I mean,
Yeah, I think it's approaching like 260 now. I've got a whiteboard with ones I need to add to the list.
that's awesome.
I actually found somebody online at one point who had written a list of about 300 fungi that they had tried, and this was like very early on into my mushrooming, and I was like, oh, now that is a goal that I would like to work for and exceed. So I'm on my way. But yeah, there's so many things out there, like beyond just the few major edibles that people know, and there's some really good stuff out there that people don't know about. And like the Gomphidius I have in my fridge right now, like they look kind of nasty. They have this bright yellow stem base and they get these black spots on them. But it's been a little while since I ate them, but I remember them being pretty good. And so I'm going to have more of those. But like, yeah, you never know what you're going to be able to find or not find. So the more that you can diversify your palate, like, good to know, as long as it's
come home with something,
Yeah, reasonably known to be safe.
Yeah, exactly. You don't take too many risks there, but I think there's a lot of things you can do, and I think you and I have both done this, where you say, okay, I'm going to try this new species. I'm going to make sure it is exactly what I think it is. I'm going to make sure that there's no reports of it being, inherently toxic. I'm going to try talking to other people who have eaten a lot of mushrooms. I don't have a direct line to David Aurora, but I can occasionally hear through the grapevine what he's tried and what he hasn't tried, kind of thing.
Yeah, he tries a lot of stuff.
A lot of stuff. And then there's little things you can do, like if there's slimy bits, like on the Gomphidius, I peeled off some of the slimy bits because sometimes those slimy exopolysaccharides can cause some GI issues. And then you cook things low and slow for a long time, so you make sure they're really well cooked. And you can try just a tiny bite. Don't eat a lot. If it's your first time trying a mushroom, don't eat a whole bunch of it. Just have a small bite. See if your tummy feels okay. All those types of things. And that gives you a lot more lateral movement in the different things you can try. And I think kind of keeps you somewhat safe. So. Yep.
And another thing is, like, there's a lot of fungi for which the edibility is unknown. But, someone probably did try it at some point, at least if it's like larger. So there's like poisoning database reports. The North American Mycological Association, NAMA, has a poisoning database, and there's a 30 year poisoning report PDF that you can look at, and so you can see if there's any reports or associated with that species. And also, if you get poisoned by something, you should definitely make a report, because that is so helpful.
Yeah.
So, hopefully it's not on there. You ask other people, but also you look at its closest relatives, and you can gather some data from that. Like, is there anything else that seems like it's closely related to it that has some of these incidents? And, sometimes you have to just be the one willing to take that leap, but like with relative caution.
Yeah, and you can inform, we're talking about inform your decisions, make sure there's not a closely related species that happens to be toxic, and just don't take stupid risks, and you'll usually be okay. And the worst that can happen to you most of the time, as long as you're not eating something that is a high risk mushroom, is maybe you get a little diarrhea or something like that. But who hasn't happened?
I'm usually willing to risk a little bit of diarrhea for science. But it very, very rarely happens.
Yeah, good. I'm glad to hear that. I remember you telling me that one that had given you trouble was Psilocybe pungicens, which is a fairly common
not
Psilocybe.
pungents.
No, it wasn't pungicens.
I tried pungents.
Oh, maybe that was Chad. That was somebody else who.
And
Luteus.
actually
Okay,
a few other Psilocybe as well. My body just does not seem to like Psilocybe. Even if I peel the caps, even if I take the pores off, several of the Psilocybe, if my body was just like, not so much.
Nope. Just is what it is. So.
And I also don't like the flavor of them enough to like bother too much.
Yeah, that's fair.
But
sometimes I pick Psilocybe.
I respect you.
Yeah, it's one of the things you can usually find. I like other things better most of the time, but I'll try them occasionally. So before we leave, I want to ask you about something really exciting that happened in Oregon in this last election. And there's not all positive news came out of the election, but we got one big positive, which is a good thing. And Oregon got some leeway, some very interesting legal leeway with Psilocybe species. Mm-hmm. So I believe there was a law passed saying that I guess all drugs were somewhat decriminalized, which I think makes the enforcement much easier and hopefully will help law enforcement prioritize the important stuff and not just hassling people over, a dime bag or whatever it is. There was Psilocybe species, I think, were fully legalized, or were they? I'm not totally sure what it was. Okay. I know so therapy was legalized, but yeah, tell me what happened.
There were two measures. So there's Measure 109, and what Measure 109 did is it made psilocybes legal in certain circumstances for medical use with the supervision of a trained person. And there's 2 years that are going to they're going to develop a more comprehensive plan for exactly how that works. So that's not at all in place yet. And there's definitely some criticism, I think, to be made of that, because that is commercializing them.
Yes.
However, I still personally feel like it's a partial win, because it is offering, the potential of some sort of psychological benefit to people who may not have had access to them otherwise. I think we can still do better, but I consider that it's a step in the right direction, because definitely. It is making something that may help people more available. So to me, the better measure was 110, which decriminalized all drugs in Oregon. So that doesn't mean that you can't get in any trouble for any drugs. There are still quantity limits, and there still is a potential penalty for possessing small amounts, but it's $100 fine or a treatment program, rather than like sending people to jail for things. And
especially those small amounts versus like people who are moving hundreds of pounds of stuff across state lines. Exactly. That's very different.
So unfortunately, the amounts are still very small. So if someone possesses more than 12 grams of psilocybe, which if you're like picking in a park, say, you could very easily go over that limit. And to the best of my knowledge, someone correct me if I'm wrong, it's still a felony if you have more than that. So
So 12 grams. Maybe carry a scale.
Right. But you know, that's something that was put into place for various reasons, but also because it was putting people of color into jails far more than necessary. It was you know, discriminatory targeting of people, and so hopefully this will have a good effect in that way. And also, just like if someone wants to go and pick psilocybes somewhere, you don't have to worry about having a felony on your record for just picking some mushrooms that come out of the ground, you know, as long as it's under 12 grams.
Right. And I think for me, one of the funniest things about psilocybe and the legality of it is that the mushrooms themselves aren't illegal. If they're growing somewhere, it's not like there's going to be a guy who comes by with like a flamethrower and torches all of them, especially because they're usually in like the wood chip beds of a Bank of America or an apartment building or something like that.
Right.
It's all about the illegality comes from your intent. If you're picking them and you don't know what they are, I don't think it's technically illegal. But if you pick them with...
it still technically was illegal because you're in possession of them, but I think it could be argued that you did.
But yeah, if you don't know what they are and you're just like, I'm just curious, I'm just going to pick this mushroom so I can take a spore print and do microscopy and try to figure out what it is. It's not illegal until you understand that it is kind of, you know, a magic mushroom and you have the intent of eating it as a magic mushroom. So that's, for me, that's always really weird. The legality is all about intent. And you're like, how do you really truly infer that? And again, how do you make something that just grows in nature illegal when it's just there, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it has always been stupid that it's fine to observe it, it's fine to be there, it grows there, you can't do anything about it growing there for the most part, but once you hold it in your hand, it becomes illegal. Right. And that's, you know, we just need to burn it all. Or something.
Yeah, there's definitely a better way to do it. And I have high hopes that in the next couple of years, we'll see some major national movement. There's clearly been a lot of momentum with Paul Stamets and Michael Pollan and all those, you know, there's a lot of legitimization that's going on with Johns Hopkins studies. And I think the movement towards having legit psychotherapy applications up in Oregon will be a really big one. We're going to see a lot. We'll see vets coming from all over the country flying to Oregon to have these kinds of treatments. Cancer patients. There's going to be a lot of people coming in who want to benefit from this. And what I hope is that it can stay not too commercialized. Because like you mentioned, there's a lot of companies out there who see this and think it's going to be another gold rush. And ultimately, we want it to be a thing for mental health and a thing to make the world better, and not just another opportunity to enrich the people that are already too rich, you know?
Yep. And I also think that we need to temper to some extent our expectations about what this might do for people. It's not a magic pill for anyone. And there's definitely people who I think should not engage in psilocybe use, especially
for other mental health reasons, brain chemistry.
Mental health issues, it can potentially exacerbate some of those. So, you know, it's definitely something to be thought about carefully.
Yeah, definitely. Well, cool. I'm excited to hear that, you know, there's progress being made, and that for me, the biggest thing is usually people are asking me about psilocybe. I'm like, I don't want to talk about it because of the legal aspect. And I don't ever want to encourage people to go look for them, because you can suddenly, you're picking up a mushroom, and if a cop sees you picking up a mushroom, he can arrest you because you're in possession suddenly. You don't even know
have a felony.
Necessarily. Right. And you're like, holy cow, that went from 0 to felony really fast.
Yeah.
So definitely something to be. And the other thing that blows my mind is a lot of people go out looking for magic mushrooms, and they find stuff that are not magic mushrooms, and they just want to assume that it's magic. And there's a lot of little mushroom stuff like Sulfurtufts, Inosebes, Gallerinas. Those are all very toxic mushrooms, and people pick those up thinking that they're psilocybe, and they don't have the tools to kind of do the quick ID or really understand the difference. And again, if a cop saw you gathering them, they might think you're gathering magic mushrooms and arrest you for picking up Sulfurtufts, which is stupid. Right. But you know, that's there. But the other thing I worry about is people eating these mushrooms, thinking they're magic mushrooms, and getting very sick. So again, be very careful about, you know, where you harvest, what you're looking at, and
right. And actually, you know, there's a whole bunch of little brown mushrooms that are completely harmless that you also people often mistake for them. But yeah, they don't always have the tools, and they're very hopeful that
Very
every
helpful.
little brown mushroom that they find is going to be a magic mushroom, and that's just not the case. Almost all of them aren't.
Right.
So make sure that you're learning about that, and they're actually not that hard to identify for folks who are just learning how to do it. If a mushroom has both dark purple, brown, black spores, they're almost black, but
Hmm.
just short of that. And it also has blue bruising. And don't try and convince yourself that it has blue bruising when it doesn't actually, because I've seen
Right.
like darkened Gallerina stems that people are like, "What? It's blue bruising." Um, so it needs to have both blue bruising and dark purple brown spores. Then it is a psilocybin containing mushroom. And it really only those two things need to be true. Typically, they also have gelatinous pellicles, so that's like a little bit of gelatinous cap covering that you can peel away that some of
Mm.
the lookalikes, I don't think any of the lookalikes actually also have. But if you just do the spore prints and you look for that bruising, that should be enough to separate it out from everything else. Like your Gallerinas have rusty brown spores. It's not anywhere near the dark purple brown. So Tubaria also has brown spores. Mycenas
Mm-hmm.
have white spores. And none of these things have blue bruising, but sometimes people talk themselves into seeing things they want to see.
Right.
Yeah, and
Definitely.
also as far as the habitat, usually you find these things in landscaped wood chips. You don't find them out in the forest. Like you can find them out in the forest. It definitely happens, and they're native to Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, and like probably did originally grow right in the forest. But generally speaking, the place that you find them is in landscaped wood chips in
Wood
the
chips. Yeah.
city.
Right. And if you don't live in Florida, basically, you're probably not going to find Psilocybe cubensis because that's the one
Yes.
that grows on cow patties. But in the rest of the country, it's too cold for cubensis because it's a sort of subtropical
Right.
species. So maybe in the southeast you'll find them, but outside of that, you're not going to find them naturally growing
Right.
um,
It is
up
not
here.
a cube. It is never a cube
Nope,
unless
never a
someone
cube.
sold it to you because they were growing them.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
there's legal aspects issues with. So just be careful, and I'm hopeful and happy that Oregon is making some forward progress. And I guess just be aware of that 12-gram limit because otherwise you can be in deep doo doo. There's a big difference. Again, that seems really arbitrary that on one side it's a civic fine and the other one is a felony. There's not a lot in between there. But
Right.
12 grams is your limit. So definitely keep that in mind.
Right. But I am hopeful that because there is now this law about it being decriminalized with small amounts, that it's not, the people are less likely to be a target
Yeah.
for these sorts of enforcements. We have a question about, do you know how cyanescens, Fubarhan, hi, how do you know how cyanescens are both saprobic and associate with dune grass? So yeah, so first of all, Psilocybe azurescens is the one that people usually think about being associated with dune grasses, but I have been searching for azurescens before in the dune grasses and encountered Psilocybe cyanescens, the wavy caps, instead, and they are also growing in that same habitat. And my understanding is that both of those species are saprobic on those dune grasses. So it's not that they're like mycorrhizal or anything as far as I know. It's just that they are eating the old dead grass.
And they like that sandy habitat.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think it's been about an hour, and I want to say thank you so much for taking some time to chat with me. It's always a pleasure to see you, and I hope once COVID is sort of passed or the levels are falling again, that I can come back to Oregon and we get a chance to go out in the woods and explore some more because I learn from you constantly, and I'm so excited that you are sharing your knowledge with people. I don't think you have any upcoming classes now, but in the future, when you have classes, I'll let people know. Definitely go give
Yep.
Leah a
Probably in
follow.
April, I'll
And,
be doing some more online classes.
cool. Yeah, it's super informative, and you're an amazing teacher, and we're all lucky to have you. So thank you so much for being
Thank
an
you.
amazing voice in this mycology community.
Thank you. Yeah, and if people want to sign up for any of those classes, I have a link tree in my profile that has upcoming events. And as soon as more events happen, I will put them in there. So keep an eye on that if you want to sign up for things or watch classes.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Say hi to B for me, and
Okay.
I hope you're
Will
well.
do.
So, okay, bye.
Okay, bye. Thanks for having me.
Bye. Absolutely, it's been a pleasure.